The readings for today are by Sean Wilson, and they're out of a book called Research is Ceremony. So we're talking about setting a context for culture and research, because in the library, as well as in various museums, galleries, and other types of public or publicly accessible information, you are going to encounter information from various sources that come from various backgrounds, and at times you may actually be accessing information that, had the tribe or individual had a choice in the release of that information, you wouldn't be reading it. It was actually inappropriate for that person to talk about that issue or that information, and yet they did so. Or there might have been an anthropologist or a scholar present at a certain ceremony, and they recorded what was done. And then they published it as part of their dissertation or their research, and information that was considered private or secret became public. There are individuals, including Native Americans, who published so-called secret information that were actually ostracized from their communities because they disclosed information that should not have been put out there, or they were talking on behalf of people that they should not have been talking on behalf of. An example out where I'm from, there was an anthropologist whose name was Arthur C. Parker, who did some amazing, amazing work. But he also published things that he should not have published, because he, as well as other anthropologists in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, did a lot of unethical things from the viewpoint of the community that were considered perfectly ethical from the viewpoint of the academy, of the university, of the museum. So we are in a very real way shaped by the context in which we encounter information. We are shaped by the institutions, whether they be professional and academic or cultural. They condition us to see the world, to interpret the world, and even record the world in different ways. So this is really important when we're doing research as a curator for exhibitions, because we may be reading some really great stuff, and we know that people would go right out of their mind to read it. They'd want to see this object, knowing that it was used for this ceremony, or it had this purpose. And yet, if you were to display it, you might be doing something that offends people. May even get you ostracized not only from your own community, but from other communities. So it's really important when we're looking at doing research, you have to question the source of the information. And that includes, where did they go to school? What are their professional degrees in? And for that matter, what other types of professional and experience do they have? And for that matter, what is their reputation? Have you ever heard that expression, if you lie down with dogs, you're going to get up with fleas? Or credibility by association, or guilt by association? So you really want to be aware of sources of information. So when we're looking at art or museum studies and curatorial theory, and that within this process, we're not only imagining, but we are proposing and we're developing a platform, in essence, exhibits, catalogs, printed information, or podcasts, or film, for curatorial dialogue and practice, right? Because the work that we do becomes part of overall curatorial theory. And that's something that you often don't think, because you're sitting here in the classroom and you're listening to Fadden doing his ranting and raving. And you don't realize very often that when we think of history and we think of theory, we think of something that's outside of us. When you learn about history, you think of something that happened back then, rather than something that you're living in right now. And for that matter, through your action, have the ability to affect how things are. That's our most amazing creative process, is the history that we create by conscious decisions that we make now of how things are going to be for us, our families, and our community. History is something we create. It's something that we are active in. It's the same way with theory. It's something that we are active in, that we activate and that we create. And through the work that we do in our various exhibitions, we are creating history. We're not just displaying it. We're creating it. So, with this in mind, how can the curatorial projects that we are going to envision, how are we going to make sure that we provide an appropriate means? And that includes culturally appropriate. How do we do this in such a way that we can actually facilitate awareness of not only the cultural differences, but also the ethnic differences, and the gender differences, the social class differences, the age differences, all of this stuff that contributes to our diversity? How can we make sure that our projects are going to be approachable? And for that matter, how are people across this broad spectrum of backgrounds, how are they going to benefit through what we produced for them? So we have, in many ways, shared dilemma. A dilemma we might look at as a problem. That how do we address socio-cultural issues? All right, that we have a society of people that lives within a culture. All right, so for example, if you are, say you're Hikaria, do you have medicine societies? I'm not going to ask you who they are, all right, but they reside within the larger culture of Hikaria. It's the same way when we look at in the United States. There are various societies that reside within the larger culture of what we call an American. Now, one of the things that's really hard for people to imagine about America and America having a culture is because there are so many people of so many different backgrounds here. It really is hard to put a distinguishable label on what we would call American, and to show you cultural differences and why we need to be aware of looking at things from many various perspectives. So we need to be aware of the cultural dynamics in what we curate. So these dilemmas, all right, how are we going to present socio-cultural issues that we're looking at? Not only confronting past, but also print hegemonic curation. Now, hegemony as the term is something that falls within the control of something else. Have you ever heard of someone having a hedge outside of their house? A hedge in many ways is a boundary. Boundaries are meant either to keep things out or keep things in or to control something. And when we talk about hegemony, that there are many theorists who argue that the control of history has been to dictate, for example, of Europe. So they developed terms such as Eurocentrism. So history told from the perspective of Europe. Or when we're looking at art history, as we study it until only the 1980s, had a very distinct Italian, Florentine, post-Renaissance bias. That when you're reading the textbooks, when I was in college here, Chuck Daly had us reading Gardner's History of Art. If you really look at who was in that art textbook, until the year 1900, there's no women. Women don't do art. Women have babies, unless they're angry women with swords. Women don't do art. So when you look at this whole textbook there, I'm not kidding you, till you see Marie Cassatt, an impressionist painters who in the United States had to go to France in order to get their work appreciated. Cassatt wasn't known as an artist here. She had to go to France in order to get her work seen, because women don't paint here. Women do craft. Women crochet. They embroider. They don't sculpt. They don't get out there with blowtorches and sledgehammers and jackhammers. So when you're reading art history up until that time, you're reading a Florentine view of art history. The irony being, when we're looking at who gets to be called artist, at the same time Marie Cassatt has to go to France to get noticed, there's this Hopi woman. Her name is Nampeo of Hano. She happens to be in the right place at the right time, working with the right archaeologist whose husband is working on the site. Now, there are other potters who are as good as Nampeo, but she happens to be in the right place at the right time. But still, the power to make her visible was not hers. The power ultimately came from an anthropologist, archaeologist, who published her work. He had control over who would see her work in such a way when you are in a gallery, when you're at an auction, and someone says, that's a numpeo, no one says numpeo who.